Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming today for our Introduction to Organic Plant Health and Pest Management workshop. This is the first workshop of this kind that I'm leading, so I really appreciate your patience and flexibility with me. I want to start off with a big thank you to Nicole Scheffler and Jabril Cooper, who are our program assistants and AmeriCorps service members who are going to be supporting the workshop today. Just a few housekeeping kinds of things. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation. If you kind of move your mouse in Zoom and you look down, there's a bubble down at the bottom that says chat. That's a good place where you can kind of type your questions and we'll get to them during a proper question and answer section. If you look at the bottom left, there's a little microphone that says mute. If you click that mute button, that puts you on silent. So that way if you have a dog barking or something noisy happening behind you, you can kind of mute yourself. And remember that if you want to ask a question, you need to click unmute. Okay, same thing right next to that, there's a place where you can start and stop video. I personally love seeing your faces and your reactions. But you know, if there's something, again, if you need to take a step out or something distracting is happening behind you, you can also stop your video. Are there any questions about housekeeping before we begin? Okay, and again, if you want to do anything in terms of a question, there's a way to actually like raise your hand if you hit the reaction button, or you can simply type in the chat box. Okay, thank you so much. Are we ready? I'm going to share my screen. Hang on, I just want to make sure I'm sharing the right screen. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for our Organic Plant Health and Pest Management workshop. This is a very simple introduction to organic pest management. Just a little bit of background about myself. My name is Christina Zawerucha. I'm the community garden manager for Vines. I've been working here since February, although I love Binghamton and lived here about 15 years ago. And you know, I've had a lot of work experience in agriculture, and really my major exposure to organic pest management was when I was working for a startup in Ethiopia called Green Path Food. They hired me to be director of agronomy for what is now Ethiopia's first certified organic fruit and vegetable company. And, you know, I had dealt with some, you know, organic pest management issues in Northeast Pennsylvania. It was nothing compared to the kinds of challenges that we had to see over there. And it was the kind of issue where, you know, you're growing 25 different crops at export market volumes, and it's not a rich country. It's very difficult to get materials over there. So for the first time ever, I was seeing pests and diseases I had never seen before, on a scale I'd never seen before, in a different language with a different market, and a lot of the products that, you know, you might be able to buy very easily here are not available there. So we had to do a lot of problem solving, a lot of observation, a lot of, you know, if you wanted to use neem oil, we had to grow it and process it into a neem oil. And that said, you know, I have to say that there is so much that I don't know. And, you know, part of, you know, good pest management is actually observing, asking questions of local people or gardeners who have a lot of experience, and asking them what has worked for them and what hasn't worked for them, and then leveraging that to share with others. So again, you know, I'm still very much learning. I've taken a couple of pest management courses myself at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, but I wouldn't say, I feel like most of the learning has happened on the ground through observation, experimentation, and then responding to that feedback. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I've learned and observed, and I'm going to respond to your questions as best I can. And, you know, if I don't know the answer to your question, I'm going to politely say, you know what, let me get back to you on that. And that's part of being a good pest and disease manager, is just taking the time to acknowledge what you do and don't know, and then making the effort to investigate and find the answer. So with that caveat, I said I'd like to learn more about each of you. So we have a poll. Let's see how I get into the poll. And this is just a little bit just to hear about who we are in the audience. So we'd like to know how many years of gardening experience you have, where it is you plan to be gardening, and on a scale of 1 to 5, how important is it to you to grow food without chemical pesticides or herbicides? So it looks like 2 people have voted.
Is 5 being, it's the most
5
important?
is the most.
Okay.
So looks about half of the participants have voted. I'll give you guys another 20 seconds to vote. And about 90% voter turnout. That would be great. All right, so I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to share the results. So it looks like about half of us have less than a year's experience gardening, and a little less than half of us have more than 4 years of experience gardening. So it seems like a great opportunity for us to learn from each other. I'm glad to see the community gardens represented. And it looks like we have a lot of gardeners who are either growing in containers or directly in the ground. And it's really interesting. So about half of us feel super strongly about not using chemical pesticides and herbicides. And then other people are more towards the middle. Okay, so that's really good to see the array of perspectives that people bring and the experiences people bring to this workshop. Going back to sharing my screen. Okay, so there are a lot of different approaches to integrated pest management, but this whole idea of integration, this idea of when you're dealing with pests or diseases attacking your plants, none of these events happen in isolation. When you're growing your crops, you need to think about how you're growing your crops in an ecosystem. And so anytime you're dealing with any kind of insect pests or weeds or diseases, it's because there's some kind of disturbance or imbalance in the force, if you will, in the ecosystem that is your garden. So integrated pest management, it's an approach to managing pests and diseases that's very nuanced. It's not exclusively organic or non-organic, but involves inspecting, identifying, and documenting any kind of pests or diseases that you see, analyzing what the situation is, and then if you see that there's a certain threshold beyond which you would like to take action, Then you decide what the course of action is. You monitor how effective that action is, and then you decide whether you want to keep applying again. And again, your pest management goals might have a lot to do with your personal goals. If you're just growing, cabbage for your own personal use, having slugs, eating a few holes might not be an issue. But if you're selling, to high-end supermarkets in New York City and you can't have a single hole in there, then the kinds of strategies you might take, your threshold might be higher or lower for certain amounts of pest pressure. Every action you take has an opportunity cost. And especially when you scale up, the kinds of actions you might take have different kinds of consequences and take certain amounts of energy. And then there's this idea of plant health care, which is really about taking care of your plants from the very beginning through their entire life cycle, so that way your plants are as strong as possible at resisting pest and disease pressure. So we'll get into that in a minute. If we want to look at the integrated pest and disease management pyramid, and actually I won't be able to see you guys anymore, but I'll be able to read my slide a little better. A lot of people take an approach where you're focused on preventing any kinds of pests and diseases from the very beginning, right? So choosing the best kind of soil, choosing the best plant for that particular climate, choosing varieties that are pest and disease resistant. That's a form of prevention. Then beyond that, we have culture and sanitation, right? So practices like crop rotation, so you don't wind up depleting nutrients or inviting pests that continue to live in the soil in a particular site, planting cover crops, sanitizing your tools between one plot and another plot, or one plant and another plant. That helps stop the spread of pests and diseases. There are physical and mechanical approaches to pest and disease management. These could include physical barriers to keep pests out, or of course, everybody's favorite practice of weeding or collecting and removing pests and weeds, which is very common. Biological controls, which gets into this whole systems kind of approach where you release predators or diseases that will attack the pests. And then chemical pesticides are pretty much a last resort, because when you use a broad spectrum pesticide or herbicide, you're trying to target, the pest that you want to remove, but you're also going to have an impact on other insects and plants in your system that are actually beneficial. And we're going to take a little more look at that later. So in terms of plant health care, this is focused on preventative maintenance and really making sure that we're promoting plant health from the point of it being a seedling all the way to the end of its life cycle. And so if we take a look at this picture here, I don't know how many of us have kind of woken up feeling like the lady in the photo here. I know I have. And so the question is, when you look at this woman, if somebody was about to go and attack her, God forbid, how strong would she be at fending off this attack? So when we talk about the health of our plants, making sure that they're receiving adequate sunlight, adequate water, adequate nutrients, that they're growing in the right climate for them, that they have the right kinds of companion plants and lack competition. All of these is sort of building up your crops to be as strong as possible, so that way they don't become attractive to pests. Or, if a disease if they're exposed to something, their immune systems can actually fight it off. So a big part of prevention is choosing the right plant for the right place. And, a lot of people, they're like, oh, I really want to grow cherries in New York State, or I want to grow pineapple. And the truth is that a happy, boring plant is going to be more attractive and more successful than a struggling, exciting one. And it's really important to choose crops that are adapted to the local climate and culture. In Green Path in Ethiopia, for example, we had buyers in Saudi Arabia who wanted jalapeno peppers. Jalapeno peppers did not grow well in the Ethiopian climate, despite what we predicted, but local heirloom varieties of seedlings were adapted to that particular environment. So again, thinking about the types of plants you choose that are designed for that particular ecosystem they're going to have developed over time to be resistant to pests and diseases, as well as your weather patterns in a particular area. You want to choose crops that grow well in your soil type. If you have more acidic soils, you might want to plant more blueberries per se, or you might, if you have more, more basic soils, you might plant more root crops. So it's a question of what works best for you. And of course, planting crops at the right time. Planting something too early or too late in the season will put your plant at risk. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So one of the ways that you can kind of figure out right plant, right place is by, even looking at the back of your seed packet. So I'm going to ask us to do a little activity. Just out of curiosity, how many people will read the back of the seed packet before you plant? I see one person raising their hand. Okay, so when we look at the seed packet, and I kind of jump back a little bit, there's a lot of great information to look at. So I'm going to ask us to do, which is a little different from some of our previous workshops, is I want you to read the seed packet on the left. We have a seed packet with some information about the crop that Cynthia wants to plant, the sunlight it needs, the water it needs, the timing it needs, and then this is the Columbus Park Community Garden on the right. And so what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes, read the packet, read the map, and let's think about, well, where would you put these crops and why? And if it's too hard to see, I'm happy to read out loud also.
People are saying please to read it out loud.
Okay, I'll read it out loud. This is garden chives. This easy-to-grow perennial heirloom grows in mounded clumps and can be tucked in any small space in the garden near the kitchen. Harvest the greens with mild onion flavor for use on baked potatoes, fish, and egg dishes. The pretty purple flowers attract butterflies and bees. And then if you look here in the bottom left-hand corner, we have a map of the United States. And it looks like Binghamton is in green. So you got the map on the left. On the right, there's a little chart that says planting time. So I'm going to look at that chart, and it says blue is you'd plant it between May and June, green between April and June, yellow between March and May, red between February and March. On the bottom, it says that these plants like full sun, moderate water. They like to be planted 1/8 of an inch deep with 12-inch spacing between each plant. And it takes 75 days until harvest. So I'll ask the first question, which is, where would you plant these seeds and why? Based on the information on the packet and on the map on the right.
Mm.
And for some reason, I don't think I can see the chat box. So Nikki is going to have to share the chat box with me. I'm also happy to kind of read through it myself.
Some people are saying near B in the south.
Okay. Why would they say B?
Because it needs a lot of sun.
Okay.
Yeah, someone else says in the sunny edge, maybe close to other pollinated plants.
Okay. So we have some people saying, here on B, because it's towards the south. And at the same time, I'm going to push back on that because what do we see in this Google image? If you see trees. So even though, generally speaking, you do want plants that love the sun to be exposed to southern sunlight, but at the same time, you've got to watch out for trees and buildings that might be shading where those plants might go. But the person was right. Generally speaking, you'd want it on the south side of the garden for full sun, but we got to be mindful of any kind of trees or buildings that might be shading.
But it looks like the way that gardens are oriented, the sun would rise in the east and go across the garden to the west. So you might have sun all day.
Mm-hmm.
So really you could put it in A, C, or B, to me.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts? Yeah, no, that's great. There's really no wrong answer here, right? This is a discussion.
Well, especially because chives will grow forever wherever you put them.
Right, the packet says that it's a perennial.
Yeah.
Right, so if I look at the raised beds here, generally speaking, the people gardening in that plot might change year to year. But we might put perennials in some of the perennial beds that are generally on the edges of the gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so these are just some things to think about. What about the question about when you might plant them? Did anybody try tackling that question?
April to June, April, May, April through June.
Awesome, and I'm assuming people got that information from the back of the seed packet. So planting them in July might not be the best move. Planting them in March might be a little too early. But maybe some of the people with like 4 or more years of experience might want to give a tackle to question 3. How would you plant these seeds and why?
Well, it says you plant them like 1/8 of an inch deep, which really isn't deep.
Mm-hmm.
So there's different methods. You could scatter them, mix them with a little of your soil and sort of scatter them, or just put them on the top of the soil and then just sprinkle some soil on top. That's what I usually do. It's not always successful, but.
Mm-hmm. Anybody have any other thoughts? I think that's a good approach.
The person says a well-prepared bed, somewhere a perennial can continue to grow. This person says could also start in cell packs to transplant.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so definitely a really great strategy is to actually start your seeds indoors at the beginning in smaller cell packs, as that person suggested. Simply because you can give them more care and attention. Like when we're talking about having a healthy, strong plant from beginning to end. If you can really provide proper nutrients and conditions for those seedlings in the beginning, and then harden them off as you transplant them out, you might have a higher success rate. So yeah, this was just a little experiment, something a little bit participatory to get our minds going. And I want to say thank you to all the brave people who jumped in and shared their ideas and experience. That's great. So again, talking about how plants grow in systems, not in isolation. So you think about the light and water needs of every single plant, their pollution tolerance, particularly in an urban area. I mean, right now we don't have as much traffic in Binghamton because of the shutdown. But if you're planting in a place that's highly trafficked, or if there's a lot of road salt or things like that, that might influence what kind of plants you choose to plant, the nutritional needs of the plant, competition between species, and the ecological services offered by different species. When I talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. Okay, so soil health is the foundation of the plant. It impacts a plant's ability to access water and nutrients, to defend itself from pests and diseases. And depending on what kind of soil you plant a crop in, certain kinds of weeds or competitors might have an advantage over the crop that you're planting. So there's no one perfect type of soil. Different plants have evolved to grow in different conditions. And so sometimes, we see this issue like where people are applying a lot of composted manure or a lot of fertilizer. And then they see a big burst of weeds and their own crops are actually not benefiting from the application of these fertilizers. And it's because a lot of the time, if you're doing a lot of tilling or if the soil is very poor to begin with, the weeds are actually developed to have a competitive advantage in those disturbed conditions as compared to regular vegetable crops. So again, it's very important to think about the right plant for the right place. And I'm not going to hammer that too much.
Someone asked what kind of soil was in Arseningo's garden. So I'm wondering if maybe they want to know kind of how to determine what kind of soil you might have.
Okay, so we're going to go into that. There's a lot of different kinds of soil tests that we can take. Generally speaking, you can do a simple, test inside of a bottle. And actually you can see the silt, sand, and clay particles descending inside the bottle within 48 hours. And then you can use that. I'm kind of skipping ahead. I don't know if I should skip ahead or if I should, wow, it's already 6 o'clock, huh? All right, I'm going on way too long. But yeah, there are many different kinds of soil tests that you can take. You can also send soil samples to Cornell Cooperative Extension or to Brooklyn College is where I always used to send my soil samples. We also, I think, send a lot of them to Penn State and UMass Amherst. My understanding is that right now there are a lot of delays in soil tests because of COVID-19. But there are different things that you can test. And in Otsenango, I think it's very clear that this is a silty soil. You have very fine particles, and you can see evidence that it's the bottom of a riverbed. So you'll see a lot of deposits of those round stones. And what's nice is that the roots generally do a good job of actually breaking through and growing around those stones. So even though people are complaining about how stony the soil is, it's actually very rich soil. It's a nice place to grow if you can work around all those stones. And if you really want to get into, what is the soil type exactly, there's the web soil survey from NRCS, which I was going to put in here, but I was like, it's a little too nerdy. but I can send it to you in the resources. And with that resource, you can actually type in the address and zip code of your site, and you can get all of the soil data for that site over time, based on the Natural Resource Conservation Services studies. So I'll include that in the resources after the workshop. And so when you think about a soil, it's a mix of biotic and abiotic factors. And so you're thinking about not only like what is the substrate of the soil, but also what kinds of organisms, bacteria, fungi, and other animals that are in there in the rhizosphere of the plant that are helping it absorb nutrients or might be posing a threat. Okay, a few things to think about. I'm kind of jumping ahead. But if you're asking about the kind of soil that you have, some of you have maybe seen a chart like this, but you can simply take a cup of soil from different areas of your garden, actually shake it up in a mason jar with water and a little bit of soap, and then based on the layers of particles, the sand particles will fall first because they're the largest, and then silt, and then clay. And then based on those percentages, you can find out exactly the physical characteristics of your soil. You can classify it that way. And so the texture and the structure of your soil will determine how your soil behaves. And this is important because, the structure of your soil can determine, well, how does air circulate around the roots of your plants? How does water percolate in that system? What kinds of organisms are able to move through? One problem that happens over time is soil compaction. So I see it a lot at the urban farm where people come to volunteer and they walk on the garden beds because they think it's a path and saying, please stay on the path. Because what happens over time, whether it's from machinery or from animals or humans walking, it'll create compaction, which can actually impact the drainage of the soil in that area. It also comes from excessive tilling. So you can see in places where people are plowing and plowing and plowing excessively, you'll get like maybe 18 inches, like up to the point like where the plow blade goes down, and then there's a cement layer. And it actually winds up being very problematic because if you look at the image here, when you have non-compacted soil, the plant roots can go deep into the ground and actually absorb water and nutrients. Even when it's extremely hot and dry, it's able to get nutrients and water without it as much of a problem because it can go deeper. Whereas when you have that compacted layer of soil underneath from excess plowing or mechanical compaction, the root system is actually blocked and stops. And so that's like why you sometimes see flooding in a field. And it's because it's not able to get through that hard pan. And that causes problems because the anaerobic activity, the lack of oxygen, will create conditions that are acidic, that will promote the growth of certain kinds of bacteria like verticillium wilt or Phytophthora root rot that wind up impacting your crops. It also develops alcohols and other acids that can burn the roots of your crops. So, maintaining a good soil structure is really important. The good news is that soil structure is something that you can change pretty easily. The simplest way is through mulching, getting a bunch of leaves at the end of the growing season and layering them down. Sometimes you can ask your local municipality to drop them off for you. You can also use newspaper or cardboard or wood chips. Wood chips are preferred for perennial crops, and then straw or leaf mulch would be better for your annual vegetable crops. Planting cover crops with deep roots like radish or canola that can actually penetrate deeper into the soil. Top dressing with finished compost throughout the season can introduce microbes that can actually break down nutrients and circulate nutrients through the soil. The woman in the image in the left is using a broad fork. So even if you don't want to till the soil too much, if it's the first time you're working with soil, you might want to till it initially, just so you can get in there. Then after that, you can perforate it with a broad fork, or even with a simple spear in order to break through that hard pan underneath. And double digging, if you really want to torture yourself, it's a John Jevons practice that's used to get deep into the soil. It sounds like some people are familiar with that. So talking about chemical properties of soil, the pH of your soil is actually one of the most important things, especially around here. You know, you might see nutrient deficiencies in your plants, and you say, "Oh, well, it looks like there's a lack of iron for my blueberry plant, and I'm seeing an iron deficiency." The problem might not be that you don't have enough iron in the soil. The problem might be that the pH is such that you don't have that the electrons are not making it possible for the nutrients to be available to the plant roots. And the cation exchange capacity of soil particles depend on the size of the particles. So for example, clay holds nutrients tighter, so it's actually harder for roots to absorb those nutrients. Whereas sand, has a very loose bond. And so one of the simplest ways to kind of improve the chemical properties of your soil is to add compost, add mulch, keep on adding organic material, and that can help make macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium available. And then there are a lot of other micronutrients that are very important that we think a little bit less about, like boron or copper or molybdenum. They're all very important for other aspects, particularly fruiting and flowering of crops that we might think about a little less. So if you take a look, and this is all in the PowerPoint I sent out to you guys, this is a pretty typical pH chart for plants. And so when you look at this chart, it can show you what pH value is ideal for different kinds of crops. And so the way to read this is that you see when things are extremely acidic, each nutrient is going to be narrowly available. The wider it is, the more that nutrient is available for the plant roots to absorb. And the narrower it is, that means that it's harder to get. So if you look at this, what appears to be the best range for nutrient availability for crops?
Generally like 6.5 to 7.5.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can see that for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, iron, all of these guys are generally best available between 6.5 and 7.5. And there's some variation between vine crops versus root crops, but generally speaking, you want to get your soil into that neutral range. So how can I adjust the pH for my soil? Okay, so you could take the approach of saying, well, you know what, my pH is a little bit acidic, so I'm going to focus on planting crops that grow better in acidic soil. Or it's alkaline, so I'm going to grow a lot of vine crops, let's say. That's one approach that you could take and just kind of work with the ecosystem as it is. And then there are other techniques that you can use. So something very common is to apply limestone. People talk about like liming their garden before the growing season. So I put some application rates in this presentation just as a general rule of thumb. But of course, you always want to test your soil first. see where it's actually at, and then read any kind of material that you're going to add to your soil, just so that way you don't. It's always possible to add more, but it's very difficult to remove once it's in there. So generally speaking, applying about 2 pounds of limestone powder for every 100 square feet 2 months before planting would increase your soil pH. Or you can decrease your soil pH by applying elemental sulfur, about 2 pounds for every 100 square feet. Or just one of the best ways to do it is to add compost. Did somebody have a question?
I was just gonna give you your time check. It is 6:15.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being patient. We haven't gotten to a lot of the good stuff. So here's something that might be good. You want to be scouting and monitoring your crops all the time. So this is just a general chart that, again, it's general for most plants, but you can see symptoms of different kinds of nutrient deficiencies. So if you see white yellow leaves with tiny growth, that's the sign of nitrogen deficiency, in which case you might want to top dress with composted manure or coffee grounds. If you see like little twisted leaves in the new growth, that's usually a sign of a calcium deficiency. So you might want to apply some extra lime at the beginning of the season, or if it's during the growing season, you can dig in gypsum at a 1/2 pound per 100 square feet. For iron deficiencies, which for me personally, it's very hard to distinguish between a magnesium deficiency and an iron deficiency. But you can apply chelated iron either as a top dress or as a foliar spray or blood meal. But generally speaking, you want to check the pH first to make sure that that iron is available, that it's in the right pH scale. For phosphorus, you can top dress with bone meal. You can do something as simple as keeping your chicken bones, drying them out, and if you have a Vitamix food processor, powdering that and applying that. Otherwise, you can buy it, at Agway or other kinds of stores. For a magnesium deficiency, you can apply Epsom salt. You can use it as a foliar spray, or fish bone meal. And then for potassium deficiency, you can use wood ash, but at very small amounts. I wouldn't put too much wood ash at once, but sprinkle it almost like you would sprinkle salt around the base of your plants if you're seeing signs of potassium deficiency. Here's just an example of some soil test results, just for your own information. If you were to send something into Brooklyn College or to Cornell, you would get test results like these. And then some of the important things that you might test for other than soil nutrients is for, if you look at the second slide, different kinds of heavy metals that are known to be toxic. So one of the reasons why at Vines we strongly encourage people to plant in raised beds or in containers is because in industrial cities like Binghamton or like New York City, there are a lot of toxins, unfortunately, that have accumulated over time in the soil. So you want to make sure that what you're planting in is below the recommended, below the danger zone, so to speak, for these different heavy metals. And by planting in raised beds, you're basically creating a barrier between your crops and any kind of soil that might be contaminated. Any questions? Or what questions do we have? No questions, okay. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit just to get to some of the things that I think might be of more interest to you. There's a lot that we could talk about. The rhizosphere, which is the actual area between the roots of the plant and the micro ecosystem that exists there. There are a lot of relationships that plant roots have with fungi and bacteria, which is why it is so important to circulate oxygen and encourage microbial growth. A lot of fungi, they might have negative impacts on plants, but then there are also some mutualistic relationships like mycorrhizal fungi that help the health and nutrition of your plants, that help them uptake nitrogen and other nutrients. So you can actually look in this image here, you can see some redwood seedlings. The one on the left was not inoculated with beneficial fungi, and the one on the right was inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. So you can see the big difference in terms of the health of those plants. A lot of people like to grow in mushroom compost, or they like to plant other types of fungal growth, or using leaf mulch can be beneficial for your crops to encourage the healthy kinds of fungi that you might want to have growing. Skipping ahead, and then a lot of the microbes are, beneficial, and then some are kind of like, there are good protozoa and there are bad protozoa. There are good nematodes and there are bad nematodes. And so there are a lot of people that use, like Dr. Elaine Ingham in University of Washington, does a lot of work on compost teas and probiotics. You hear about probiotics for the human gut. Well, there are all kinds of probiotics for plants. That could be a whole other workshop. So we're going to skip ahead to another game. This one's a game. I'm going to put it up just like the poll. And the game is called Good Plant, Bad Plant. So there are 6 suspects here on the screen. I'm going to put up the poll. I'm going to ask you to vote which one you think are good plants and which ones you think are bad plants. Are you ready? Let's see. I'll do this, polling. And here we go. Good plant, bad plant. Okay, so 5 out of 9 people voted. Give you guys another 15 seconds to vote. Okay, anybody still voting? Can I end the poll?
Sure.
Okay. This is actually really, really interesting to see what the different responses were. But here are some of our answers. So the first plant is pigweed or Amaranthus retroflexus, which some people are very actively removing from around their gardens, but in Vietnam and other countries, they're considered a delicacy. You can blanch them and, stir fry them. They can be quite delicious.
Is it common? I don't know if I have ever seen it. Have I?
It's definitely growing around Otsinango Garden.
Okay.
It is a pretty common weed, and usually people try to remove it before it gets too big.
Yeah. It looks like mint to me. Just that picture.
And actually, well, if you look at the stem of it, like a mint stem would have more of like a square stem. This has more of a round stem.
Okay.
But you're right. It does look very similar. It's actually in the amaranth family.
Okay,
So if you ever heard people who are gluten-free might be eating amaranth,
right, amaranth.
same family as that. Japanese knotweed. This is a very invasive species that has been introduced to this area. It was brought over because it's a beautiful plant. But the truth is that the difference between a weed and a crop is simply, the desirability of that plant and its competitive abilities, how it's adapted to compete. So Japanese knotweed, it's, if you see it, please remove it. There are many different strategies for removing it. Best thing to do is to physically remove it, dig out the rhizomes, and wrap them in a plastic bag and have them just cook in the sun. But it's interesting because it's considered a delicacy in Korea and in Japan, and the honey that's made from the blossoms of Japanese knotweed it's considered to be some of the best honey. So it depends who you ask how good or bad of a plant this is. Plant number 3 is fava bean. Sometimes people are growing crops that we don't recognize. We had an incident where somebody was growing fava beans in their garden and somebody else came and weed whacked them away because they thought they were a weed.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so I mean, some things are very common in one culture and not in another culture. So generally speaking, it is good to kind of be mindful and really assess, well, what is this plant? What services is it providing? What is the nutritional use? And just kind of, you might be trying to help, just check in with the grower and find out what their thoughts are on that particular crop. Lamb's quarters are a very common weed. You can harvest it and cook it in a quiche if you want to. Dandelion. Most of us, want to remove it as quickly as possible. At the same time, it's one of the first plants that actually starts blooming in the spring. And for honeybees and other pollinators, it's often their first food source. So you got to make these calls about, well, do I want to support pollinator health, or do I want to make sure that my lawn looks really great? And then morning glory, Ipomoea imperati or Ipomoea purpurea, really, people plant it because they think it's beautiful. But at the same time, it is a noxious weed that takes over everything. So again, good plant, bad plant, it's really subject to interpretation. So again, weeds are simply very well adapted competitive plants. Characteristics of weeds, they have the ability to reproduce very rapidly when they're young. They usually have multiple modes of reproduction. I mean, any plant is capable of reproducing by seed or by cutting or by vegetative propagation. But usually weeds are really well adapted to this. They can tolerate a wide range of environments and weather conditions. Sometimes they're seeds. You can throw them in the compost and they'll come back next year. There are some seeds that, they plant 100 years later and they still germinate. And they tend to have very extensive root systems. You got to get those root systems out. Invasives and how they impact the environment. So something like Japanese knotweed, back in its native ecosystem, there are organisms that eat that plant and that can grow with it and compete against it. But here it's just like such a powerful new organism coming in that it winds up creating a monoculture and basically smothering out all other crops. And until sometimes we do see cases where a plant becomes naturalized, where certain types of organisms learn to start eating it, but it sometimes takes a long time. And then it has a lot of other effects in terms of erosion control and things like that. And a lot of the things that, one of the reasons why these plants come over here is because they are beautiful and they are vigorous. So like the Norway maple or the butterfly bush were brought here because they are beautiful plants that perform well. And at the same time, when they're not contained, not controlled, they wind up taking over. So again, when you think about managing your system, the more you till, the more weeds you're going to get, because the weeds grow best in disturbed soil. If you have too many nutrients, if you're applying too much manure or too much fertilizer, that will also encourage chickweed and other kinds of weeds. And of course, compaction, like I mentioned before, it can be really harmful for your crops, but really good for these weeds that are so competitive. So some of the options that you have when dealing with weeds or invasive plants is pulling and removing these crops. Make sure that you get the root out. And it's very important that once you've removed that weed, to either mulch it to stop something new from growing there, or immediately planting another plant that offers the same service in that site. You know, so if you pull out a dandelion, you know, plant something else in that spot, so that way you don't get a new weed growing in that disturbed space. Cutting crops back, especially like during the high season, that might be one of the only options you have. So weed whacking and chopping back Japanese knotweed is still a better idea than just letting it go out of control. It does slow it down from spreading because it's putting more energy into regenerating itself. And as long as you're removing that material from the site, you're helping fight it back. And if you keep on harassing it, it will start to die back. Altering the conditions, so changing the soil pH so it benefits your crops more than the weeds is good. And then adding more of the plants that you want is key. And again, disposing of invasives. I really encourage people when you're removing weeds, if the weeds, try to remove the weeds before they start to flower. And if they are native weeds, you can go ahead and put them in the compost before they flower. If they have started to flower, or if it's an invasive plant, best thing to do is to put it in a garbage bag and throw it away. And you know, a good middle path is put it in a garbage bag, let it cook in the sun for 2 days, and then you can add it to your compost. But again, these are very resistant plants. And so it's a good idea to manage them. Any questions about weeds before we dive into insects?
Just to let you know, Christina, it is 6:30 now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikki. If anybody needs to go, I understand. Otherwise, we're going to play one last game, and we'll get into the bugs, and then we're done. So how do I do this? Polling. Now we're going to do poll number 2. Good bug, bad bug. So here we have 7 insects. You do not need to identify them, just decide, is it a good bug or a bad bug?
I don't know what it is.
Yeah, if you don't know what it is, you know, you don't want to judge a book by its cover, but maybe there are clues. Maybe you look at what's happening around the
Right.
insect,
Right.
look at its behavior, make an educated guess. All right, I'll give you guys 10 more seconds. And I'm going to end the poll. I'll share our results. So the first insect is the Japanese beetle, which has wreaked havoc all over. You can see how it absolutely skeletonizes the leaves that it attacks. Bug number 2 is the pirate bug, which is a good all-purpose predator. It's a good bug that will eat aphids and whiteflies and midges and all kinds of insects that we don't want attacking the plants. Number 3 is the aphid. I think everybody got that right, that it's definitely a bad, bad bug. You got to look under the leaves and on the new growth in order to find them. Sometimes they're not easy to see. And then we've got our ladybug. Most people voted for it as being good, and I think in general we agree that she is. As a predator, they do wind up eating aphids. Spider mites. Some people might look and think, oh, it's a spider because of the webbing that you see growing on the plants. But spider mites are a big problem, and that webbing is not used to catch the bad bugs. Monarch caterpillar is very important pollinator species. And then the cucumber beetle is a bad, bad bug. Okay. So it's very important. Like insects, they're problematic in and of themselves. I mean, they're eating our vegetables, they're making them unsightly and unmarketable, but it goes beyond that. These insects are vectors for other pathogens and viruses, bacteria, and fungal infections. And so the technical term is vector, and they have piercing, sucking mouth parts that basically leave open wounds on the plant that wind up being vulnerable to fungal and viral and bacterial infections.
What is that picture of?
This
That looks nasty. Ooh.
Yeah, it's I'm actually not sure which insect that is. I took like a lot of photos. Like this is, I think, a parasitic wasp.
I was gonna guess some sort of wasp.
Just from like looking at the abdomen. I think that there are some wasps that are really good because they actually inject themselves. They're parasites on aphids, for example. And then there are other wasps that, you know, lay eggs inside of your plant and can cause problems for the plant. But I forget which kind of wasp that is, one of the bad ones. Okay. And so whenever you're scouting your fields or your garden, you're looking for the difference between signs and symptoms. And so, you know, it's very important to identify what the pest is because that will determine what kind of approach you use to fight back against it. So, you know, some signs would be, so for example, what we call frass, which is basically insect poop. The professional word for insect poop is frass. And so sometimes you'll see little black specks on certain parts of the plant or around the base of the plant, and you know, oh, for sure, you know, this was an infestation from a beetle, right, or something else. Fungus has very distinct kind of fungal fruiting bodies, and then bacterial ooze. Just generally speaking, if you deal with a plant and it's slimy, you know it's a bacterial infection. Fungal infections, if you break the plant, it'll be dry. But bacterial infections will always be slimy, and then you know you need to take an antibacterial approach to managing the plant. And then a lot of symptoms are kind of general. And usually the symptoms are what we see first, right? So wilting or changes in the color of the plant, or seeing you know, necrotic or dying tissue. There could be numerous causes for why we're seeing these symptoms. But again, you want to scout through your fields regularly. It's a really good idea. Like if you have like a field like you might have at Otsinango, you're going to want to walk in a Z pattern or an X pattern through your field, because sometimes you walk around the periphery and everything on the outside looks just fine. But you actually like want to walk through and check regularly what's going on the inside. It's a good idea to carry a little hand lens. Sometimes you can just get like a jeweler's loop. You can get them for like $10 or $15 on the internet. It's a really good tool for looking at these insects or at the frass up close so you can help identify what it is. It's very important to not just look at what's on the surface, but actually turning leaves over. A lot of insect pests will be hiding underneath the leaves because, you know, the predators that eat them, like birds or pirate bugs or wasps, they're looking for them, so they're trying to hide and stay camouflaged underneath the leaves. You can set up lures or sticky traps and use that to monitor regularly, well, how many whiteflies am I catching every week? And if there's a spike, you might want to, take some action about that. And again, depending on what your harvest goals are, you might decide to take action or not. So aphids, I think, are one of the most common insect pests that we see around here. You want to check the undersides of the leaves and also along the stem and any kind of new growth. They are teeny tiny, and they have piercing, sucking mouth parts where they actually suck the phloem out of the plant, and they leave behind a honeydew. And so sometimes you won't see the aphids, but you'll see the ants that come after that are harvesting the honeydew left over from the aphids. Even if you don't see the aphids themselves, you might see evidence that they have been there. So one of the best techniques for dealing with aphids, at least from a preventative perspective, is planting under row covers. What I mean is, and I'm going to show some photos in a little bit, but if you ever go to the urban farm, you'll see that Kyle has put hoops over all of the cabbages and then like a thin landscape fabric above it. And that's just to create a physical barrier against any type of insect that might be coming to eat that plant. There are certain kinds of insects that we can use for biological control. So you can release ladybugs or lacewings that love to feed on aphids. And something that a lot of gardeners do will be that they'll plant dill or fennel or yarrow to attract the insects that feed on aphids. You can also plant what's called a trap crop. So planting nasturtium is, it's nice because it's an edible plant, but aphids love nasturtium. So if you plant nasturtium around the perimeter of your garden or you put it on the outside, the aphids will go to the nasturtium instead of coming and eating your crops. It's like putting chocolate cake out next to your salad. They're going to go for that. And it's called push-pull pest management, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It's really important once you've identified your pest to understand the life cycle, because depending on what state, first of all, an insect looks very different, from the point where it's a larval stage versus its full adult stage and any kind of intermediary stages. So something might look, you think it's gone, but actually it's metamorphosized into something that you didn't recognize. And at different stages in its life cycle, that's the best time to hit it with soap and water or with neem oil. Sometimes it's good to get it when it's in the egg stage as opposed to the adult stage, or certain predators attack them at certain stages of their life and not others. But again, it's very specific for every single insect. Cultural control, again, I said it's very important to install barriers like the roll covers, rotating your crops, not planting the same crop in the same space every year, especially in terms of not only the nutrient availability for those crops, but certain types of fungus and virus and pests will stay in that soil over winter. And if you plant the same crop in that space, you're just asking for trouble. And of course, it's very important to sanitize your tools between plants even. if you can. It's just like, all of us are washing our hands these days and using sanitizer. You can use hydrogen peroxide solution or an alcohol spray solution and spray your pruners between sites. If you're in a place where you've been exposed to, I don't know, downy mildew or some other kind of pathogen, you might want to change your shoes before you go and visit another person's garden. Give them a good wash and not spread the disease around. Again, talking about biological control, not all insects are bad. So it's good to attract some of these insects, and you can even order insects online and release them. But it's also a really good strategy to try and attract these insects. So planting dill and fennel are generally a really good strategy for attracting lacewings and ladybugs and midges and other crops like that. Push-pull pest management. This was a strategy we used a lot in Ethiopia. And so this idea of like, okay, the more diverse you make your garden, the less of a focus area you make for predators or for insect pests. So if you have a monoculture of only tomatoes, you're going to get a whitefly infestation. But if you're planting all kinds of particularly aromatic herbs that wind up confusing and distracting these insect pests, it's going to be harder for them to find what they're looking for. And if you intercrop with barriers between your different sites of the same crop, they might attack one portion of your field, but not another portion of your field. Okay? And then the whole idea of planting what's called a push crop and a pull crop. So push crop might be something like geranium, which Japanese beetles find toxic. So you plant geranium around the periphery of your garden, so that pushes them away. And then you have a trap crop of something that they really love outside of that. Something like nasturtium, which they will just jump for and enjoy. You can also do, like what we would do is something called perennial pathways, where we would plant lavender and rosemary and chives around the perimeter along with marigold. It was different combinations for different kinds of crops. And we would try to sell those if they had an export market value. But you can attract pollinators, attract predators, and also push away the insects that you don't want. A lot more research has been done on push-pull management with regards to larger commodity crops, like sorghum or maize or wheat. Less has been done with what we call specialty crops, like what most of us are growing in our gardens, the fruit and vegetable crops. So my suggestion is read up and experiment and see what you observe, and keep on tweaking from there. I'm going to skip ahead with this skill to go. It's a whole other thing. Cucumber beetle, I know we've heard a lot of complaints with this. Again, planting under row covers, releasing predators, planting trap crops, setting up sticky traps. Very easy to set up a sticky trap. Just take like a yellow envelope. For some reason, aphids and whiteflies are really attracted to yellow. So take a piece of yellow paper or cardboard, coat it with Vaseline, and it's going to trap those insects. You can use that to monitor. Also, something that's like more of like a commercial option, but you can also use is that a lot of these insects do not like reflective mulch. So if you use something like mylar or aluminum foil as a mulch around the base of your plants, the insects do not like it and they will go elsewhere. They don't like being held up to the mirror, so to speak. Spider mites. Spider mites and a lot of other insects, I'm just going to talk about using insecticidal soap. It's a very simple, time and tested solution. We talk about soap and water bursting, the outer shell of COVID-19. It's the same idea for the exoskeletons of a lot of these insects. So it's very simple to mix in 1 tablespoon of liquid soap. It could just be Dawn, or you can use Dr. Bronner's or some kind of Castile soap, and then spraying periodically. And that usually will break through the shell of insect eggs and also their exoskeletons. Again, looking at signs and symptoms, I think we kind of went over this already, but looking for discoloration, wilting, any kind of physical damage, changes in growth patterns or cankers and galls can be an indication that there is some kind of infestation. So if something just doesn't look right, you know, take a photo of it, go online or contact me or contact your site coordinator, and we're here to help you figure out what the issue is.
Christina, someone wants to know if you have any suggestions for decreasing 4-lined plant bugs. They have significantly damaged their perennial flowers. Also black spot.
Black soot?
It says black spot.
Black spot. So there are a lot of different things that can cause. If you could email me a photo, Christina@vinesgardens.org, and maybe we can help identify what it is and then figure out solutions from there. Because I'm not sure what the exact cause is from that description. Skipping ahead, watering, scouting, fruiting, sanitation, signs of bacterial infection, you see that slimy string. Preventing viral infection. So there are a lot of things like a lot of different kind of viral infections like tomato mosaic virus. You simply, all you have to do is just remove and destroy those plants. And try to, again, intersperse your plants, intercrop them so there's plenty of space. So that way you don't have those insect vectors spreading the disease from one batch of plants to another. Also, when you're shopping for seeds and seedlings at the beginning of the season, you can choose varieties that have been bred to be resistant to different kinds of viruses. Disinfecting tools is very important when you see signs of different kinds of viruses. And if you find a virus in your plants, do not replant the same species in that spot. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead. Powdery mildew. This is something we see a lot on cucumbers and watermelon and squash. Very simple solution is milk and water solution. 1 cup of milk, 10 cups of water, spray it every other day on the top and bottom of your leaves. There's all this research out of the University of Sao Paulo where they found that it was more effective than commercial fungicide. That's a really good technique. And then the larger pests. People might be asking about deer or about rabbits or groundhogs. For deer, these women are not the pest. Look at the fence behind them. This is at the Deerfield Garden in Vestal. And if you look at the fence behind them, you'll see it's what we call a double fence. So deer, their depth perception is such that if you have 2 fences, one on the outside and one on the inside, it doesn't even need to be a strong fence. Like it can just be, a pole and some netting. They look at that and they cannot judge how to jump in, and so they decide not to attack. So again, if you kind of design your gardens that you have 1 fence on the outside, then make a 4 feet space and then a 2nd fence on the inside, that can help stop deer. There are certain crops that deer do not like marigolds and astilbe and catmint. You can plant those. As far as birds and squirrels go, very simple bird netting, thin plastic netting, which you can see here in this picture above this broccoli that's growing. I recommend putting that over your blueberry bushes, over your raspberries or strawberries if you're having any issues with birds or squirrels. I had another page about groundhogs and rodents, but I don't see it here. So very similar. If you're dealing with rats or other kinds of rodents, particularly if you're in an urban environment, you need to dig a trench around the base of your fence, probably about 16 inches deep. It's a big project. And then put in 1/4 inch steel wire, steel mesh down there in order to stop them from being able to dig through. That will also prevent rabbits. You would use a similar technique for that. But you could get away with some larger chicken wire with rabbits or gophers, but for rats, it needs to be very small. And again, you know, a lot of pests do not like being harassed. You do not need to kill or poison any of these larger pests in order to get them out of your garden. It sounds terrible, but if you find a rabbit hole or a rat nest in your garden, fill it with water, they'll get out and they won't want to come back. You know, filling it with gravel repeatedly, eventually they get tired of being harassed by the gravel and they will move elsewhere. And, you know, have a heart traps, they work sometimes, but there are rules about you cannot release them elsewhere. If you're working with a wild animal, you can't release them someplace else. So I think that harassing is a better technique for getting them out of your garden space and going someplace else. In terms of a couple of resources that I think might be useful for you, these are 2 of my favorite books. One is Natural Pest and Disease Control by Fern Marshall Bradley and Barbara Ellis. And that's a very comprehensive book that will go way more in depth. And if you're seeing problems like black spot on your perennials, you can use this book or the other book, What's Wrong with My Plant and How Do I Fix It? It's very simple. If you've ever done, you know, one of those choose your own adventure books, you can basically go through it and say, yes, my plant is wilting on the top or wilting on the bottom. If yes, go to page 53 and it can help you kind of narrow down what the problem is. So usually I would use something like what's wrong with my plant and how do I fix it to identify the problem. And then I would go into the Natural Pest and Disease Control book to get a more holistic and specific perspective on what to do to help combat that problem. There are a few online resources for weeds and invasives, which I'm going to include here that can help you with identifying invasive plants and what's an invasive versus what's a naturalized plant versus what's a native lookalike. I think I've shared a lot of information today. I think you guys have all been very patient, and I thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, now would be a good time because I know it's 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Someone's asking, does peppermint spray work to keep little animals away?
I mean, the answer is yes for a little while. Yeah. So like, you know, a lot of these pests, they learn over time and, you know, they adapt over time. I've definitely seen gardens where people have planted mint around and it just kind of takes over everything. My recommendation is to plant in containers and put around the periphery of the area you want to protect. And yeah, for certain pests it works, for other ones it doesn't. And usually it works for a while and then they figure it out. So it's always a multitude of strategies. It's not one strategy that works, it's many different strategies.
Christina, thank you. This was really good. I noticed that you didn't mention chipmunks, which are the bane of my existence this year. They have eaten every single strawberry and bite the heads off anything that pokes up out of the ground. It's really maddening this year.
Have you tried putting up the bird netting?
I have the netting on there now. I had a fence around it,
Uh-huh.
stapled to it's in a raised bed, stapled to the raised bed. They just go right through. The holes in this fencing are like less than an inch,
Hmm.
and they
And still
squeeze
find
right
a way.
through. I watched them.
Mhm.
So now I have the netting, and so there's always next year. It's a new strawberry patch anyway, so.
Mhm. I guess
But it's,
I know less about
frustrating.
chipmunks because I haven't had too much problems with them. But
This
do
is the first year that I've had issues with chipmunks.
huh.
So I don't know.
We can look into it. I mean, one of my thoughts is, do you have any pets? Do you have cats or dogs?
My neighbor has a cat, but I don't have any pets.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I know that cats can deter chipmunks. Um, so it might be worthwhile to, invite the cat to kind of hang out in the area.
Station him in the garden.
I mean, it's a trade-off, right? I mean, if you
Yeah.
put a net around your raised bed, then you kind
Yeah.
of deter the cat from, using your raised bed as a litter box, which you certainly don't want. But I would recommend, thinking about what kind of predators can keep chipmunks away. Um,
Yeah.
and chipmunks also, they don't like exposed areas too much. That kind of like makes them open to predation from hawks and
Yeah.
other kinds of birds. So if you have any kind of overhanging trees or branches, maybe pruning those back. That way they feel unsafe
Okay.
when they're
Yeah,
coming to
that's
your garden.
that's not an issue, but
Mhm. Yeah, let's look into it. Any other questions? I'm going to stop the share for a second. If you have other questions and you want to, oh look, there's so many. So if there aren't any, so first of all, if you have other questions, you can always email me at christina@vinesgardens.org, and I'm happy to look into whatever your issue is. So for example, I see a question here from Sharon Fisher. Sharon, I'm going to get back to you on the four-lined plant bug. I'm not as familiar with that. And if you would, at the end of this workshop, we're going to ask you to fill out a survey. In fact, I'm going to bring it out right now. And we use these surveys to get feedback to improve our programming in the future. So if you could just take a few minutes and fill it out while this presentation is fresh in your mind, that would be great. And this is a really good time. Yeah, here's the link. I'm not going to look at it right now, and it's anonymous, so you can, be brutal. And that's a really good opportunity to tell us what worked well about this workshop, what you think could be better for next time, and also to make suggestions for future workshop topics and formats. So I thank you so much, and a big thank you to Nikki and Jabril for helping facilitate this workshop and making sure it runs smoothly. And thank you to all of you for supporting Vines Community Gardens. I think stay tuned. We have future workshops coming up. In the next couple weeks, we'll be posting that on the events page of the Vines website. All right. Thank you so much. And
Thank you, Christina.
yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.